The restaurant was full that evening. Warm lights hung from the ceiling, giving the room a soft golden glow. People sat at small round tables, enjoying their meals and talking with friends. The quiet sound of forks and plates mixed with gentle background music. It was the kind of place where people came to relax after a long day. Near the window stood a polished grand piano. It had been there for years, becoming almost part of the restaurant's identity. Many nights, a skilled musician would sit there and play beautiful melodies while guests ate and talked. The music usually floated through the room like a calm breeze, making the atmosphere feel peaceful and elegant. But on this particular evening, the piano was silent. The usual performer had not arrived yet, and the empty bench in front of the piano looked strangely lonely. Some guests noticed it and quietly wondered if someone would come later. Others barely paid attention at all. At a table near the corner sat a young woman. She kept mostly to herself and seemed very quiet compared to the lively groups around her. Her clothes were simple, nothing fancy like many of the guests in the room. She slowly ate her meal, looking around the restaurant from time to time. Every now and then, her eyes drifted toward the piano. She did not stare at it for long, just a few seconds at a time. But there was something about the way she looked at it, as if the instrument held a memory only she understood. At another table nearby, a group of guests were celebrating something. Their laughter was louder than the rest of the room, and they were clearly enjoying the evening. One of them noticed the quiet woman glancing toward the piano. With a playful smile, someone in the group pointed toward the instrument. "Looks like the performer forgot to show up tonight," one of them joked. Another person laughed and added, "Maybe someone here should play instead." Their eyes drifted around the room before landing on the quiet woman in the corner. She had just looked toward the piano again. One of them leaned slightly toward her table and said with a friendly but teasing tone, "Hey, why don't you give it a try?" A few people at nearby tables overheard the comment and chuckled softly. It wasn't meant to be rude. To them, it was simply a light joke to fill the moment. The woman looked up, surprised that someone was speaking to her. For a second, she seemed unsure how to respond. Her hands rested quietly on the table as she glanced toward the piano again. The group laughed again, clearly not expecting her to take the idea seriously. "Go on," someone added. "The piano's just sitting there." The woman gave a small, polite smile. She looked down at her plate for a moment as if thinking. From a distance, it looked like she would simply ignore the suggestion and continue eating. That would have been the normal response. But something in the room felt different. Maybe it was the quiet piano waiting in the corner. Maybe it was the way she had looked at it earlier. After a few seconds, she slowly stood up from her chair. At first, no one noticed. But then someone from the playful group looked up and realized she was walking toward the piano. "Wait, is she actually going?" one of them whispered with surprise. Their table fell silent for a moment before a few of them laughed again, though this time it sounded more curious than teasing. A few nearby guests turned their heads to see what was happening. The young woman walked slowly across the room. She did not rush. Each step seemed careful and quiet, as if she did not want to disturb anyone. The closer she got to the piano, the more people began to notice. Some guests paused their conversations. Others leaned slightly in their chairs to get a better look. One of the waiters standing near the counter watched the scene with raised eyebrows. He looked toward another staff member as if silently asking whether they should step in. But the room remained calm. The woman reached the piano and stopped beside it. For a brief moment, she simply stood there looking at the instrument. The piano's polished surface reflected the warm lights above. It looked almost untouched, like it had been waiting all evening for someone to sit down. A few guests smiled, expecting her to press a few random keys and laugh about it. After all, the whole idea had started as a joke. The woman gently pulled the bench back and sat down. The small movement made a soft scraping sound on the floor, just enough to catch a few more people's attention. Now several tables were watching. She placed her hands in her lap and looked at the keyboard. From where they sat, people could see that she was taking a moment before doing anything. Her expression looked thoughtful, almost distant. The playful group that had suggested the idea watched closely now. Their smiles were still there, but they seemed curious to see what would happen next. One person whispered, "She probably doesn't know how to play." Another replied quietly, "Maybe she'll just try a few notes." At a table closer to the piano, an older guest folded their hands and leaned forward with interest. There was something about the moment that felt strangely quiet. Even though conversations continued in other parts of the restaurant, the area near the piano seemed to slow down. The woman lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys, but she didn't press anything yet. Her fingers rested lightly on the keyboard, as if she was remembering something. For a long second, she simply sat there. In that moment, it was impossible for anyone watching to know what was going through her mind. Perhaps she was thinking about the people around her who expected a joke. Perhaps she was remembering something far away in her past. The room waited. Someone at the playful table leaned back in their chair and whispered, "This should be interesting." A few quiet laughs followed, but even those laughs quickly faded, because the woman was still sitting there, completely focused on the piano. Her posture slowly changed. Her shoulders relaxed, and her hands adjusted slightly across the keys. To someone who understood music, that small movement would have meant something important. But to the guests watching, it simply looked like she was getting ready. The waiter near the counter crossed his arms and continued observing. More people had now turned their attention toward the piano. The restaurant was not silent, but the sound of conversations seemed softer somehow. The woman took a slow breath. Her fingers lifted slightly above the keys. For a brief moment, time seemed to pause. The guests who had laughed earlier now watched with quiet curiosity. No one knew what was about to happen. And in that simple moment, before a single note had been played, the entire room unknowingly stood at the edge of something unforgettable. The room stayed quiet for a few seconds after she placed her fingers above the piano keys. The warm lights reflected softly on the polished surface of the instrument, and the bench creaked a little as she adjusted her position. People around the restaurant continued watching, some with curiosity, others with quiet amusement. At the table where the idea had started, a few guests leaned forward with playful smiles. They still believed the moment would end in laughter. One of them quietly whispered to the others, "She's really taking this seriously." Another replied with a quiet chuckle, "Maybe she just wants to try one note." Across the room, a couple sitting near the window paused their conversation. The man folded his arms while the woman rested her chin on her hand, both watching with interest. The young woman sitting at the piano seemed calm, but anyone looking closely could see that she was taking her time. Her fingers moved slightly above the keys, then rested again, as if she was feeling the instrument before making the first sound. She looked down at the keyboard in a way that suggested she knew it well. But the people watching did not know that. From their perspective, she was simply a quiet guest who had accepted a playful challenge. Near the counter, one of the staff members quietly spoke to a coworker. "Do you think we should stop this?" he asked. The other staff member looked toward the piano for a moment and shook his head gently. "Let's just see what happens." Meanwhile, the small group that had joked about the piano continued to whisper among themselves. "Maybe she's nervous," someone said. "Or maybe she's trying to remember how the keys work," another joked quietly. A few soft laughs followed, but they were not loud enough to disturb the moment. The woman at the piano took a slow breath. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and she leaned forward just a little. It was the kind of posture that musicians naturally take when they are about to play something meaningful. But no one in the room was thinking that way yet. Many still expected something simple, maybe even awkward. One guest sitting close to the piano gently turned their chair so they could watch better. Their dinner had almost been forgotten. At another table, a family with 2 children stopped talking. One of the children pointed at the piano and whispered something to their parent, who smiled and nodded quietly. The room was not completely silent, but the focus had clearly shifted. Even the background music from the restaurant speakers seemed quieter now. The young woman slowly lifted her fingers again. For a brief moment, her hands hovered above the keys. Then she stopped again. It looked almost like she had changed her mind. A few people in the room exchanged quick glances. One person at the playful table shrugged slightly. "Maybe she's not sure after all." Another added, I guess sitting there is already brave enough. But the woman was not hesitating out of fear. Inside her mind, memories were quietly returning. The feeling of piano keys under her fingers reminded her of another time in her life. A time when music had been part of her daily routine. Long afternoons filled with practice. Simple melodies turning into complex pieces. Moments of frustration when notes did not sound right. And moments of quiet joy when everything finally came together. Those memories were distant now, but they were still there. Her fingers gently touched the keys again. This time they stayed there. She closed her eyes for a brief second, almost as if she was listening to something only she could hear. The guests watching could not know what that moment meant. To them, it still looked like someone slowly preparing to try something unfamiliar. One of the waiters walked past the piano carrying a tray but slowed down slightly as he passed. He glanced at the woman's hands and then at her face. There was a calm focus in her expression. Not nervousness, not confusion, just quiet concentration. At the table where the joke had begun, the group had grown more curious now. The laughter had faded, replaced by anticipation. "She's really taking her time," someone whispered. "Maybe she knows a little," another replied. A few more guests had begun turning their chairs to watch. The restaurant owner, who had been standing near the entrance, also noticed the gathering attention around the piano. He looked over with mild concern at first, but then he simply folded his arms and observed. The woman adjusted her hands again. Her fingers spread gently across the keys, resting in a position that looked natural, almost practiced. Anyone who had spent time around music might have recognized that small detail. But most people simply waited. The seconds stretched longer than expected. One of the children at the nearby family table whispered again, "Is she going to play?" The parent smiled softly and said, "Let's see." At the playful table, one guest leaned back and crossed their arms. "Well," they said quietly, "if she plays even one good note, I'll be impressed." The others smiled, but even they had started watching more closely. The woman at the piano opened her eyes again. Her gaze stayed on the keyboard. Her fingers moved slightly, pressing down very gently on one key, but not enough to make a sound. It was almost like she was testing the weight of the keys. The polished wood of the piano reflected the light as her hands shifted again. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then she lifted her fingers once more. And finally, she pressed the first key. The sound was soft, but clear. It echoed lightly through the quiet space around the piano. A few people blinked in surprise. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Before anyone could react, another note followed. Then another. The first few notes formed a gentle melody, slow and careful. At the playful table, the smiles slowly faded into curious expressions. One guest leaned forward slightly. "Wait, did you hear that?" Across the room, the waiter who had passed by earlier paused near the counter and turned back toward the piano. The woman continued pressing the keys slowly. Each note connected smoothly with the next. The melody was simple at first, but it had a calm beauty to it. The sound floated across the restaurant like a quiet breeze. More conversations began to fade. Guests who had not been watching earlier now turned their heads. Something about the music felt different from what they expected. The woman's fingers moved with more confidence now. The hesitation from earlier was gone. Her hands glided gently across the keyboard, finding the right notes without searching. A few people exchanged surprised glances. Someone whispered softly, "She actually knows how to play." At the table where the joke had begun, no one laughed anymore. They simply watched, because the quiet guest they had teased only minutes ago was now creating a melody that filled the entire room. And the moment that had started as a simple joke was slowly turning into something none of them had expected. The first few notes drifted through the restaurant like a quiet question. They were soft, gentle, and careful, almost as if the piano itself was waking up after a long silence. For a moment, the room stayed completely still. People who had been talking only seconds earlier paused mid-sentence. The young woman kept her eyes on the keyboard. Her fingers moved slowly at first, touching the keys with patience and control. The melody was simple, but it carried a calm feeling that was hard to ignore. At the table where the joke had started, the group exchanged surprised looks. One of them leaned forward slightly and whispered, "That actually sounded good." Another nodded without speaking. The music continued, flowing gently from one note to the next. It was still quiet, but there was something steady about it now. The hesitation from earlier had disappeared. Near the counter, a waiter placed a tray down without taking his eyes off the piano. The soft melody seemed to spread through the air, reaching every corner of the room. A couple sitting near the window stopped eating entirely. The man slowly lowered his fork while the woman tilted her head slightly, listening more carefully. The young woman at the piano did not look up. Her focus stayed completely on the keys. Her fingers began moving with more confidence now, shifting smoothly across the keyboard. The melody grew a little fuller. It was no longer just a few careful notes. It had rhythm now, pattern, a quiet story starting to unfold. One of the guests sitting closer to the piano leaned back in their chair and whispered, "She really knows what she's doing." Another guest nearby slowly turned their chair so they could face the instrument directly. The music continued building in small, gentle steps. The woman's hands moved with calm precision. Sometimes her fingers crossed over each other. Other times they spread across the keys in wide movements. To someone who knew music, it was clear that this was not beginner playing. But most of the guests didn't know how to describe it. They only knew that something unexpected was happening. At the table where the laughter had started earlier, the mood had completely changed. No one was joking anymore. One guest rested their elbows on the table and watched closely. "I didn't expect that," they murmured quietly. Another person simply shook their head with a small smile of disbelief. Across the room, the restaurant owner stepped a little closer. His earlier concern had faded, replaced by curiosity. The melody slowly grew stronger. The woman pressed the keys with more energy now. The notes blended together smoothly, filling the room with a warm and emotional sound. The quiet background noise of the restaurant had almost disappeared. People were no longer focused on their meals or conversations. Instead, they were listening. The woman's shoulders relaxed more as she played. Her hands moved naturally, almost effortlessly, as if they had done this many times before. A few guests began to notice something interesting. She wasn't looking at sheet music. There were no notes placed on the piano. She was playing everything from memory. That detail made several people exchange surprised glances. At a nearby table, one guest whispered softly, "How does she remember all of that?" The melody shifted slightly, becoming richer. It carried a gentle rise and fall, like waves moving across water. Some notes were soft and delicate. Others were deeper and stronger. The contrast made the music feel alive. The young woman's fingers traveled across the keyboard faster now. The quiet introduction had turned into something more expressive. Her posture had changed as well. Earlier, she had looked uncertain. Now she looked completely comfortable. Her back was straight, her shoulders relaxed, and her hands moved with quiet confidence. A child sitting with their family near the middle of the restaurant stared at the piano with wide eyes. The child whispered something excitedly to their parent, who smiled and nodded while continuing to listen. Near the counter, the waiter who had been watching earlier leaned closer to another staff member. "She's really good," he said quietly. The other nodded. "I think everyone's realizing that now." The melody continued growing. It moved into a new section that sounded brighter and more energetic. The woman's hands began moving faster across the keys. The rhythm picked up, and the music filled the room with a lively flow of sound. A few guests smiled as they listened. Others simply watched in silence. At the table where the idea had first been suggested, one of the guests slowly leaned back and let out a quiet breath. "I can't believe we thought this would be a joke," they said softly. Another replied, "We definitely misjudged that." The group fell quiet again, their attention completely captured by the performance. Meanwhile, the young woman at the piano seemed lost in the music. Her expression had softened. Occasionally, her head moved slightly with the rhythm, almost like she was feeling each note as it passed through the room. She still hadn't looked at the audience. Her world seemed to exist only between her hands and the keyboard. The melody flowed smoothly into another change. This time the music slowed down slightly, becoming softer again. The sudden calmness after the lively section created a powerful contrast. Several guests leaned forward in their chairs, listening even more carefully. The gentle notes echoed lightly through the restaurant. It felt almost like the music was speaking without words. A woman sitting near the entrance quietly placed her hand over her chest as she listened. The performance was no longer just surprising. It was becoming emotional. The young woman's fingers moved delicately now, touching the keys with careful control. Each note felt intentional. Each pause between notes felt meaningful. The room remained completely focused on the piano. Even the kitchen staff had begun peeking through the doorway to see what was happening in the dining area. The restaurant owner crossed his arms again, but this time there was a small smile on his face. The music continued flowing like a quiet story being told one note at a time. And with every passing moment, the people in the room were realizing the same thing. The quiet guest who had walked to the piano only minutes earlier was not just playing for fun. She was performing. And the simple joke that had brought her to the bench had now turned into a moment that no one in the restaurant wanted to miss. The melody rose again, stronger than before. Her hands moved faster now, dancing across the keyboard with skill and confidence. The sound filled the restaurant from wall to wall. Guests who had never met each other were now sharing the same silent reaction. Surprise, admiration, and growing amazement. The woman continued playing without hesitation. And the longer the music continued, the more everyone understood that this performance was far from ordinary. Something special was unfolding right in front of them. And no one in that room could have predicted it when the evening first began. The melody continued to grow, spreading through the restaurant like a quiet wave. What had started as a few soft notes had now turned into a beautiful and confident performance. The young woman's fingers moved across the piano keys with ease, as if the instrument had always belonged to her. The room was completely different now from what it had been earlier that evening. Only minutes ago, people had been laughing, talking loudly, and enjoying their meals without paying attention to anything else. Now the entire space felt calm and focused. Most of the guests were no longer eating. Many of them were leaning slightly forward in their chairs, watching the piano with quiet amazement. The music carried a deep feeling with it. Some parts were gentle and peaceful, while others were stronger and full of energy. The changes in the melody made the performance feel alive, like a story unfolding without words. The young woman's hands moved with confidence. Her fingers glided across the keyboard, sometimes pressing several notes at once, creating rich chords that filled the air. Other times, her fingers moved quickly in light patterns that sounded almost like flowing water. From the corner of the room, the restaurant owner slowly walked a few steps closer. He kept his distance so he wouldn't disturb the moment, but he wanted to hear the music more clearly. Near the counter, the waiters had quietly paused their work whenever they could. One of them stood with a tray in his hands, completely still, listening with wide eyes. "I didn't expect this tonight," he whispered to another staff member. The other nodded slowly. None of us did. At the table where the joke had started earlier, the guests looked completely different now. Their playful smiles had turned into expressions of disbelief. One of them leaned forward with their elbows on the table, their eyes fixed on the piano. "I can't believe we told her to play as a joke," the person said quietly. Another guest gave a small shake of the head. "We had no idea." The group fell silent again. The music grew stronger. The young woman pressed the keys with more power now, creating a deep and emotional sound that echoed across the room. The melody rose higher and higher, like it was building towards something important. Even guests who had not been paying attention earlier were now watching. A couple who had just entered the restaurant stopped near the door. They looked confused at first, wondering why the entire dining area was so quiet. Then they heard the music. They turned toward the piano and slowly walked inside, trying not to make noise. The melody softened again for a moment. The young woman's fingers slowed down, touching the keys gently. The music became calm and delicate, like a quiet conversation between the piano and the room. A few guests closed their eyes while listening. Others simply sat very still. At one table, a woman wiped a small tear from the corner of her eye without saying anything. It was surprising how much emotion could come from simple notes played on a piano. The young woman seemed completely lost in the music. Her head moved slightly with the rhythm. Her shoulders remained relaxed. Every movement of her hands looked natural and practiced. There was no sign of the uncertainty she had shown when she first sat down. Now she looked like someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The melody slowly began to change again. This time the music became brighter and more energetic. The rhythm picked up speed, and her fingers moved faster across the keyboard. The sound filled the entire restaurant. Guests exchanged amazed glances. At a nearby table, someone whispered softly, "She's incredible." Another guest nodded in agreement without looking away from the piano. The performance continued building layer by layer. Sometimes her left hand played deep steady notes while her right hand danced quickly across the higher keys. The contrast created a powerful and exciting sound. People who understood music could clearly see the skill involved. But even those who didn't know anything about piano could feel that something special was happening. The restaurant owner leaned quietly against a nearby wall, watching with a thoughtful expression. He had seen many performers play in this restaurant over the years. But this moment felt different. The young woman's playing carried something deeper than simple entertainment. Felt personal. Felt honest. And that made it impossible to ignore. The melody suddenly slowed again. Her fingers pressed the keys gently, creating a soft emotional passage that filled the room with warmth. The change in pace made the audience even more focused. One guest whispered quietly to another, "It feels like she's telling a story." And in a way she was. Each section of the music seemed to carry a different emotion. There were moments of quiet reflection, moments of hope, moments of strength, and the audience could feel every one of them. The child who had been watching earlier leaned closer to the table, completely fascinated. The parent smiled softly while watching the child's reaction. Across the room, more guests had taken out their phones to record the moment. They held their devices carefully, trying not to block anyone's view. But even while recording, their eyes remained focused on the piano. No one wanted to miss a second of the performance. The young woman continued playing with confidence. Her fingers moved faster again, gliding across the keys in smooth and precise motions. The music now carried a strong energy that made the entire room feel alive. Some guests began quietly nodding along with the rhythm. Others simply watched in stunned silence. The group that had joked earlier now looked almost embarrassed. One of them quietly said, "I'm glad she decided to play." Another replied softly, "Me too." The music continued rising, building toward something powerful. The notes flowed together in a beautiful pattern that seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. The young woman's hands moved quickly now, but every note sounded clear and controlled. Her expression remained calm and focused. It was clear that she wasn't playing to impress anyone. She was simply sharing the music that lived inside her. And somehow that made the performance even more powerful. The melody swelled again, filling the room with rich sound. Guests sat perfectly still, completely captured by the moment. What had begun as a simple joke had now turned into something unforgettable. And as the music continued to rise, the audience could feel that the most powerful part of the performance might still be ahead. The music had now filled every corner of the restaurant. What had started as a quiet melody had grown into something powerful and unforgettable. Every guest in the room was focused on the piano. Conversations had completely stopped. Even the sounds from the kitchen seemed distant compared to the music flowing through the air. The young woman continued playing with calm confidence. Her fingers moved quickly but smoothly, pressing the keys in patterns that sounded both strong and emotional. Each note blended perfectly with the next, creating a sound that felt rich and alive. Some guests leaned forward in their chairs as if the music was pulling them closer. Others simply sat still, almost afraid to move in case they disturbed the moment. At the table where the joke had begun earlier, the group now watched with complete attention. The smiles and laughter from before had disappeared. Their faces showed something very different now. Respect. One of them quietly shook their head in disbelief. "I can't believe this started with a joke," the person whispered. Another guest replied softly, "I'm just glad she didn't walk away." Their voices faded again as the music continued to grow stronger. The young woman's hands moved across the piano with incredible control. Sometimes her fingers pressed several keys at once, creating deep and powerful chords that echoed across the room. Other times, her fingers moved lightly across the higher keys, producing bright and delicate sounds. The contrast between the two made the performance feel dynamic and full of life. Near the entrance, a few new guests had stepped inside the restaurant. They stopped when they noticed the quiet room and the music floating through the air. One of them whispered, "Is there a performance tonight?" A waiter standing nearby smiled slightly and said, "Not exactly." The guests turned their attention toward the piano and slowly walked inside, careful not to interrupt. At another table, a couple exchanged surprised looks. "I've heard many piano performances," one of them whispered quietly, "but this one feels different." The other nodded. "It feels honest." That word seemed to describe the moment perfectly. The music did not feel forced or planned. Felt real. The young woman looked completely connected to the piano. Her posture remained relaxed, and her hands moved naturally, as if they were simply following the emotions inside her. Every few seconds, the melody changed slightly, revealing a new layer of feeling. The music became softer for a moment. Her fingers slowed down, touching the keys gently. The sound became delicate again, floating quietly across the room. The sudden calmness made the audience listen even more closely. A guest near the window quietly placed their hand over their heart as the soft notes continued. Another guest lowered their head slightly, as if the music had brought back a memory. The restaurant owner stood quietly near the wall, watching the performance with deep interest. Over the years, many talented musicians had played in this restaurant. But tonight felt special. There was something about the way the young woman played that made the entire room feel connected. No one was thinking about their meals anymore. No one was checking their phones. Everyone was simply listening. The melody slowly began to grow again. Her fingers moved faster, and the sound of the piano became brighter and more energetic. The rhythm picked up, filling the restaurant with a powerful wave of sound. Guests looked at each other with growing amazement. One person whispered quietly, "She's incredible." Another guest nodded slowly, unable to look away from the piano. The young woman continued playing, her hands moving across the keyboard with skill and confidence. The music now carried a strong sense of movement, like a story reaching an exciting turning point. Several guests had quietly taken out their phones to record the moment. But even while recording, they seemed completely absorbed in the performance. At the table where the joke had started earlier, one guest leaned back and let out a quiet breath. "I'm glad we said something," they whispered. Another replied, "I think everyone in this room is glad now." The music grew stronger again. The woman's left hand pressed deeper notes while her right hand moved quickly across the higher keys. The combination created a rich and powerful sound that filled the room from wall to wall. The performance had now reached a level that felt almost magical. The child who had been watching earlier sat completely still, eyes wide with amazement. The parent beside the child smiled softly, clearly enjoying the moment just as much. Across the room, the waiters had quietly gathered near the counter whenever they had a chance. Even the kitchen staff occasionally looked through the doorway to watch. The young woman continued playing without hesitation. Her focus remained entirely on the piano. She didn't look up at the audience. She didn't react to the many eyes watching her. It was as if the world around her had disappeared. Only the music remained. The melody began to slow down again. This time, the change felt different. The notes became deeper and more emotional, like the music was preparing for something important. Guests leaned forward slightly in their chairs. The room felt very still. The woman's fingers moved more carefully now, pressing each key with gentle control. Every note seemed to carry meaning. A quiet feeling spread through the audience. It felt like the story inside the music was reaching its final chapter. The melody rose one more time, becoming stronger and more dramatic. Her hands moved quickly across the keyboard, creating a beautiful wave of sound that filled the restaurant completely. Guests exchanged amazed looks as the music reached its most powerful moment. No one spoke. No one moved. Everyone simply listened. The final section of the performance had begun, and the entire room could feel it. The young woman's fingers moved with incredible speed and precision. The rhythm flowed smoothly, and every note sounded clear and confident. It was impossible not to be impressed. What had started as a playful suggestion had now turned into a performance that no one in the room would ever forget. The music continued building, stronger and brighter than before, and as the melody moved closer and closer to its final moment, the audience held their breath, waiting to see how the unforgettable performance would end. The final section of the music filled the restaurant with a powerful energy. The young woman's hands moved quickly across the piano keys, but every movement remained controlled and graceful. The melody had reached its highest point, and everyone in the room could feel it. The notes were strong now, almost glowing with emotion. Guests sat completely still, listening with full attention. The sound of the piano echoed through the warm space, touching every corner of the restaurant. No one spoke. No one moved their chairs. Even the waiters who had been standing near the counter were frozen in place, watching the performance with quiet amazement. The young woman remained focused on the keyboard. Her fingers continued dancing across the keys with confidence. The rhythm was fast but smooth, and the music carried a sense of determination and beauty. At the table where the playful suggestion had first been made, the group of guests exchanged silent looks. One of them slowly leaned back in their chair, shaking their head gently. "I still can't believe this," the person whispered. Another guest replied quietly, "Neither can I." But their voices faded again as the music continued. The melody now moved toward its closing moment. The pace slowly began to slow down, but the emotion in the sound grew even deeper. Each note seemed to hang in the air a little longer than before. It felt like the music was saying goodbye. The young woman pressed the keys more gently now. The powerful waves of sound from earlier softened into a calm and beautiful ending. A peaceful feeling spread through the room. Some guests closed their eyes while listening to the final notes. Others watched her hands carefully, as if they were afraid to miss even a single moment. Near the entrance, the couple who had arrived during the performance stood quietly beside each other. They had not even sat down yet. They simply remained there, listening to the last part of the music. The restaurant owner stood with his arms folded, his eyes fixed on the piano. Over the years he had seen many performances in this place, but this one felt unforgettable. The young woman continued playing the final passage. Her fingers moved slowly now, touching the keys with delicate control. The melody became softer and softer. The last few notes floated gently through the air. Then came the final note. It rang clearly through the restaurant before slowly fading into silence. For a moment, the entire room remained completely still. No one spoke. No one clapped. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. It was the kind of silence that appears when people are still absorbing what they have just experienced. The young woman slowly lifted her hands from the keys. She remained seated at the piano for a brief moment, her eyes still resting on the keyboard. Then she quietly took a small breath and looked up for the first time. As soon as she did, the silence in the room suddenly broke. Applause erupted from every corner of the restaurant. Guests began clapping loudly, some even standing up from their chairs. The sound of appreciation filled the room with excitement and warmth. The young woman looked surprised. She hadn't expected such a reaction. Her eyes moved across the room, seeing all the people who were now smiling and applauding for her. The group that had started the joke earlier was now clapping the loudest. One of them stood up completely, still shaking their head with a smile of disbelief. "That was incredible," the person said while clapping. Other guests nodded and continued applauding. The young woman stood slowly from the piano bench. She looked a little shy as she faced the audience. For a moment, she didn't seem to know what to do, but the applause continued. A waiter near the counter began clapping as well, and soon the other staff members joined in. Even the kitchen staff appeared briefly at the doorway, smiling and applauding the unexpected performer. The restaurant owner walked a few steps closer and nodded respectfully toward her. "You brought something special to this room tonight," he said warmly. The young woman smiled softly, clearly touched by the reaction. A few guests stepped closer to the piano area, still clapping. One of them said, "That was one of the most beautiful performances I've ever heard." Another added, "You completely surprised all of us." The woman gave a small, humble nod. She looked down at the piano for a moment, gently running her fingers across the edge of the instrument as if thanking it quietly. Then she turned back to the people around her. "I didn't expect anyone to listen so closely," she said softly. Her voice was calm and modest. One guest from the earlier group stepped forward slightly. "We thought it would just be a joke," the person admitted honestly. "But you turned it into something unforgettable." The woman smiled again, but she didn't say much more. She seemed comfortable letting the music speak for itself. Guests slowly began returning to their tables, but the energy in the room had completely changed. People continued talking about the performance with excitement. Some guests replayed the video recordings they had taken, still amazed by what they had witnessed. Others simply sat quietly, smiling and remembering the moment. The child who had been watching earlier tugged gently on their parent's sleeve. "That was amazing," the child said with wide eyes. The parent nodded warmly. "Yes, it really was." Near the counter, the waiters exchanged excited comments with each other. "Did you see how fast her hands moved?" one of them said. Another replied, "I've never seen anything like that here before." The restaurant owner looked around the room and smiled. It was clear that the evening had become something special for everyone present. Meanwhile, the young woman stepped away from the piano. She walked quietly back toward her table, but several guests stopped her along the way to thank her for the beautiful music. She responded with polite smiles and simple words. Despite the attention, she remained humble and calm. When she finally reached her table, she paused for a moment before sitting down. Her meal was still there, just as she had left it earlier. But the evening had changed completely since then. Across the restaurant, guests continued sharing their thoughts about the performance. Some people described the music as emotional. Others called it inspiring. But everyone agreed on one thing. None of them had expected the quiet guest to create such a powerful moment. The simple joke that had started the evening had led to something unforgettable. And long after the music had ended, the feeling it created remained in the room. The piano near the window now stood silent again. But this time it no longer looked lonely, because everyone in the restaurant knew that, for a few beautiful minutes, it had been part of something truly extraordinary.